Sure, here is a 5,000-word introduction approximate to your YouTube video story titled, "Nobody Thanked the Janitor Until He Found the Missing Child." This version includes a compelling psychological hook, audience engagement techniques, retention, strategies, trending, emotional, mystery themes, US-based tone, and cliffhanger ending. Introduction, approx 5,000 words written for video narration. It was almost midnight when the school lights flickered for the third time. Most people had gone home. The hallways were empty, at least. That's what everyone assumed. The security cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary. No forced entry, no unusual movement. Just a few blinking lights, the faint hum of the vending machine, and a custodian pushing a mop bucket slowly across the linoleum floor. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that under their noses, a 7-year-old boy had vanished from the building hours earlier. And the only person who noticed something wasn't right wasn't a teacher, or a parent, or the principal. It was the janitor, the one everyone ignored. If you're here, you're probably asking yourself the same question that got buried in every local news article and dismissed during every police report. How does a child go missing in a place full of adults, security cameras, and alarms? Without anyone noticing? That's the answer you're going to get in this video, but I'm going to tell it to you the way it actually happened, not the way it was cleaned up for the news. Not the way that officials tried to rewrite it, but the real version, the one nobody thanked the janitor for, even though he was the only reason that boy ever came back alive. And I want you to stay with me until the end. Not just because this story twists in ways you're not expecting, but because somewhere, buried in the details, is a clue. One that was missed by the authorities, by the parents, even by the boy himself. If you spot it before I reveal it, then you're not just watching this story, you're inside it. Let me ask you something personal. Ever get the feeling something is wrong, even when everything looks fine on the surface? Like walking into a room and sensing someone was there just seconds before you arrived. Or watching a teacher go through the motions, smiling at kids, while something in their eyes tells you they're somewhere else entirely. That's what this story is made of. Not monsters, not ghosts, but that creeping doubt, the thing that whispers when no one else is listening. This video isn't for everyone, but if you've ever walked past someone cleaning floors and never thought to look twice, if you've ever watched true crime and said, "That doesn't add up," or if you've ever sensed that the truth was buried under a neat little report file and a fake smile, then this one's for you. This one's going to stay with you. Let's start from the beginning. Riverside Elementary. A small public school in a town that wasn't used to news van, the kind of place where teachers have been there 20 years, parents grew up down the street, and every student knows every hallway like their own house. It was quiet, predictable. Until Friday, October 14th. That morning, the principal held an all-staff meeting. A pipe burst in the east hallway overnight, and they were short custodial staff. They'd brought in a new janitor on contract, quiet guy, kept to himself, did night shifts. No one even introduced him. He showed up, grabbed the mop, and started working. That's how little attention he got. No name badge, no welcome, no one even looked him in the eye. But what nobody knew was that this janitor used to be something else. He didn't come from a temp agency. He came from the kind of job that teaches you how to observe things, how to pick up on the one broken thing in a room full of normal. He never told anyone that part. He didn't need to, because by the time anyone started asking questions, it was already too late. That Friday was picture day, the kind of day where kids run wild in the halls, parents are on campus, and everyone's a little distracted. The missing boy, let's call him the quiet one, always stuck near the back of the line, nervous about his smile, didn't like being touched. One teacher described him later as the kind of kid you had to remind people was even in the room, which is exactly how he slipped through. Now here's where things get weird. Security. Footage showed the boy entering the hallway around 11:38 a.m. He was holding a permission slip, walking toward the office. Nothing strange. At 11:42, he passed the front security camera, then nothing. No exit, no return. Just gone. The problem was, the footage had no gaps, no glitches, no edits. According to the school's system, that boy never left the hallway, but he also never came back, which left two possibilities. Either someone deleted the footage with high-level access, or the hallway itself had a blind spot no one knew about, except one person did know. The janitor. When he came in that first day, he wasn't watching the students. He was watching the building, listening to its creaks, mapping it out in his head. He noticed which cameras had dead zones, which doors were left unlocked. He didn't say anything, not because he didn't care, but because something told him to wait, to watch. That instinct saved a life. Around 7:15 p.m., when all staff had cleared out and the lights had dimmed, he noticed something on the floor near the boiler room. A pencil. No big deal, right? Except the school had been locked for hours, and the boiler room hadn't been used in over a year. He bent down to pick it up, and saw that it was sharpened by hand, just like the ones used in the second-grade classrooms. Still with me? Good, because here's where your gut's going to start reacting before your brain catches up. He tried. The boiler room door. It opened with a soft click. No alarm, no creak, just open, like someone had oiled the hinges. Inside was pitch dark, the air stale. He turned on his flashlight, stepped in, and for a split second thought he saw movement, but there was no sound. Just that thick, heavy silence. Then came the sound no one wants to hear in an empty building. A child, whispering, just under his breath, not crying, not calling for help, just whispering. What was he saying? The janitor would later try to explain it, but couldn't quite describe it. He said it was like the boy was repeating something over and over. Not words, like a rhythm, like he was trying not to forget something. The room was empty, or at least it looked that way until the janitor noticed the air vent had been unscrewed. Inside was the boy, curled up, filthy, but alive. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't slept, but he wasn't crying. He was just whispering the same thing over and over. And here's the part the media skipped over. The boy didn't recognize the janitor, but he did recognize someone else. He said he'd been brought there by a man with a key card, a man he'd seen before, but not during the day, a man who wore a school ID. Now here's the kicker. When police pulled the access logs for the boiler room, there were no entries past 2021. None, according to official records. The door hadn't been opened in over a year, but the janitor saw something else. Something no one else bothered to check. The cleaning supply closet next to the boiler room had its doorframe shaved down. Just slightly, enough to wedge something small and thin through it. A trick used by people who knew how to bypass locks. You feel that chill crawling up your arms? That's your brain trying to connect pieces that don't fit. Because they were never meant to fit. That's the part nobody tells you. Now you might be wondering, who was the man with the key card? Why was the boy taken? And most importantly, why did the janitor never get thanked? That's what we're about to dig into. But I want to ask you something first. Have you ever been right about something and no one believed you? Ever felt that rising heat in your chest when people look at you like you're the crazy one, even when you know deep down you're not? That's what the janitor felt. Because when he brought the boy out, alive and dazed, he expected a crowd. Cheers, applause, maybe even a hug from the boy's mother. But instead, what he got was silence. Cold, professional silence. The kind that makes your stomach twist. The kind that tells you, you just saw something you weren't supposed to see. A counselor swept the boy away. The principal thanked the janitor without making eye contact, and two men in suits asked him to hand over his flashlight. They didn't say who they were with. They just showed him a badge he didn't recognize and said, "This never happened." But here's the part they didn't understand. The janitor wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't looking for credit. He was looking for something else. The man with the key card. He'd seen his face before. And he wasn't going to stop until he knew the truth, not just about what happened to the boy, but about why no one wanted to talk about it. And this, right here, is where the real story begins. Because what he uncovers next, it's not just about one missing child. It's not just about one school. It's about something much bigger that's been hidden in plain sight. Something that might be happening where you live, right now. But to understand it, you need to see what he saw next. Because 2 nights later, someone tried to erase the janitor. Not in the way you're thinking. Not with violence. With something much worse. They tried to erase his memory. To be continued. Would you like me to continue with part 2 of the story immediately, or wait until viewers reach the next section? Most people don't remember janitors' names. They pass them in the halls, maybe give a nod if they're feeling polite, but they don't really see them. That's what made him perfect. No one noticed when he came in late. No one questioned when he stayed long past his shift, and no one asked what he did before this job. But if they had, they might have recognized the look in his eyes. That quiet way he studied everything, like he was always measuring more than just dirt on the floors. He wasn't just cleaning, he was tracking. Before Riverside Elementary, he'd worked maintenance in 4 different states. Each job short, each departure quiet. Always something just off. A child went missing in Nevada, and he quit the week after. A fire alarm malfunctioned in Ohio, and he left mid-shift. There was a pattern, but it was too subtle to catch. Like someone stepping over invisible tripwires. He never stayed anywhere long. He told himself it was for safety. What he didn't say, not even out loud, was that he'd been following something. The day after the boy was found, he sat alone in the staff lounge. The principal avoided eye contact. The counselors were too busy to speak with him, and the security logs he requested were suddenly unavailable due to server issues. But the janitor didn't react. He just took his coffee black, stared at the clock that hadn't ticked in months, and waited. That same afternoon, the boy's mother was called in to review what they claimed was accidental wandering. She was confused. Her son had been terrified of dark places since he was 3, and he never went anywhere without telling her. But the report was signed, and she was given a polite warning. If she insisted on pressing the matter, it might trigger a child services inquiry. She dropped it. That's how they make things disappear, not with force, with paperwork, with fear. with just enough confusion to make the victim doubt themselves. The janitor saw the look on her face as she left the building. That dazed, hollow look of someone who's just been told their own instincts are wrong. He recognized it. He'd worn that look before. Years ago, when he stumbled across a name he wasn't supposed to know on a school personnel file in a different district. It was the same name that showed up again, in a redacted form, on Riverside's emergency substitute list. The problem was, that name didn't belong to a teacher. Not really. And when he dug into the system just enough to skim the surface, he found that the person assigned to the school on the day of the disappearance wasn't listed in any teaching database. No tax ID, no certification, just a one-time clearance code and a digital signature that looked copied and pasted. That night, he went home and opened the folder he kept buried under a loose floorboard in his trailer. Inside, a stack of printed ID badges, none of them real, a burner phone that hadn't been used in 6 months, and a photograph creased and faded of a child he hadn't seen in a decade. A child who'd also gone missing, under eerily similar circumstances. That photo was his reason, his anchor. The one thing he couldn't let go of, no matter how many places he cleaned, how many names he erased. You're probably wondering who that child was, why he keeps chasing these cases. But that's the thing, he doesn't even remember all of it himself. Not clearly. He remembers the feeling. Panic, silence, the cold white light of a hallway. He remembers the smell of bleach and something else, something metallic. But the faces, the exact date, it's like it was wiped clean. Like someone wanted it that way, and now, it was happening again. By Monday, the story had shifted. The school told parents the child had wandered into a locked closet during a game of hide-and-seek. The janitor's name wasn't mentioned. The counselor who debriefed the boy had been replaced, and a local parent who posted about the event on Facebook found their post removed for violating community standards. But what standards? No one could say. At first, he thought he might be overreacting. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe it was just a fluke. But then something happened that shattered any doubt. He was finishing up the gym floors late that night when he found a set of footprints. Small, bare, dusty, the kind only a child would make. But they weren't headed toward the exits. They were going the other way, toward the old storage annex that had been sealed off years ago. Now, here's where it gets strange. He followed the trail, flashlight low. Every few feet, the prints wavered as if the child had hesitated, as if they were being pulled, not walking on their own. At the base of the annex door, he found the last print, just one. Like the kid had stopped mid-step and vanished. The door was locked. No scratches, no signs of tampering. But when he pressed his ear to the wood, he could hear something faint, a low humming, not electrical, not mechanical, rhythmic. The same rhythm the boy had been whispering in the vent. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't random. And then, there was the substitute. A man who showed up that day, only once, and never again. There was no photo on file, just a name and a badge number that, when checked, returned no results. The staff vaguely remembered him tall, polite, a little too quiet. He didn't teach, he just observed, sat in the back of the class, took notes. But one teacher remembered something else. She said she walked past him in the hallway and saw him standing outside the nurse's office, staring at the emergency phone, not using it, just staring. When she asked if he needed anything, he smiled, said, "Just making sure it still works," and walked away. Nobody reported it. The janitor did. He sent the man's badge number to a friend from his past, someone who owed him a favor, a former analyst who now worked private intel. The message was simple: run this quietly. The response took 3 days, and when it came, it wasn't a full report, just a sentence. Badge number flagged. Multiple states do not engage alone. Still, think this was just a janitor story. He wasn't dealing with a random Redditor. He wasn't dealing with some local creeper. This was part of something wider, organized, covered up, and here's where things start to splinter. One of the boy from the same class as the missing child started acting strange, drawing symbols in his notebook, saying things in class, like the hallway breathes and you can't hear them if you don't blink. The school wrote it off as imagination. But the janitor knew better. He'd seen those symbols before, carved into the bottom of a desk in Ohio, scribbled on a bathroom mirror in Nevada. They weren't language, not exactly, more like coordinates, or codes. He tried to speak to the boy, but the next day, the child was absent, then withdrawn. Family relocated suddenly. No forwarding address, no goodbye. That was the second child gone, and yet, still, no one talked, not the teachers, not the parents, not the district, but someone was watching. That night, as the janitor returned to his trailer, he saw something strange. His doorknob had been turned, not broken, not forced, just slightly off. And on his floor, placed neatly in the center of the rug, was a single object, a sharpened pencil, the same kind the boy had dropped near the boiler room. That was the message, a warning, or a challenge, but he didn't back off, because now he knew. It wasn't about this child, or even these children. Something was hunting silence. and he was the only one listening. To be continued. Would you like the next section to begin unraveling deeper connections, introduce the shadowy organization, or continue focusing on the janitor's unraveling investigation? He didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear exactly, but because something had shifted. Before, he'd been chasing whispers, patches of missing time, strange patterns, gut instincts. But now, it was clear someone knew he was watching, and that sharpened pencil left on the rug wasn't random. It was placed intentionally, like someone had been inside, looked around, and left a message without needing to say a word. That kind of silence doesn't come from amateurs. It comes from people who know how to operate in the dark. He checked every lock, every drawer, every hidden pocket in his small trailer. Nothing was stolen, but something was missing. The hard copy of the school's original floor plan, the one he'd printed and marked up by hand, it was gone. Not the digital version, just the physical one. Which meant whoever came in didn't want to raise alarms. They just wanted to slow him down, interrupt his rhythm, force him to second-guess himself. And it worked. By the next morning, the school felt different. Not obviously, but in that subtle way a room does when someone's moved the furniture by an inch. The staff seemed tense, overly polite. One of the receptionists didn't look him in the eye. A hallway light flickered nonstop for 2 days, and no one called maintenance. And then came the biggest red flag of all: security protocol changed. Custodial staff were now required to clock in and out at a new location, the main office. He was told it was to improve efficiency, but he knew better. It was surveillance, plain and simple. Someone wanted to keep eyes on him. It wasn't long before the first warning came. Not from a stranger, but from someone he thought was on his side. The science teacher, one of the few who had bothered to talk to him like a real person, pulled him aside in the parking lot, eyes darting toward the cameras, voice low. She didn't say much, just this: "You need to stop. You're not helping anymore. Some things aren't meant to be fixed." He tried to press, but she walked off like she hadn't said anything at all. And the next day, she didn't show up for work. Official reason: personal leave. But her classroom was already cleared out, desk emptied, name removed from the directory. Just like that. And then the emails started. Not to him about him. He overheard a conversation near the copier room. Something about his file being flagged. That word again, flagged. Not fired, not accused, just quietly marked. Like they were setting the stage for something. A reason to erase him later, if needed. That's when he realized it wasn't just about what he might find. It was about what he might remember. Because the deeper he went, the more gaps he noticed in his own mind. Like how he couldn't recall applying for this job. Couldn't remember who interviewed him. Couldn't even find the original email thread. And when he called the temp agency, they had no record of sending him to Riverside. At all. Let that sink in. He didn't apply. He didn't get assigned. But he was there. Somebody placed him in that school, but who and why? Desperate for clarity, he returned to the only place he trusted, the janitor's closet. But even that had changed. His tools had been moved. A hidden USB stick he'd tucked behind the breaker panel gone in its place. A new device, something sleek, compact. He couldn't identify it at first, but then he recognized it. A signal jammer. Someone was blocking him from transmitting anything out, which meant they knew he'd been collecting data. And yet, something in him refused to stop. He pulled the CCTV backups he'd saved from the night the boy disappeared. Not the school's files, his copies. Ones he'd downloaded onto an encrypted drive, but when he played the footage this time, something was different. The hallway sequence, the same stretch he'd watched 20 times now, had a new detail. A shadow, just for a frame, near the boiler room, too tall to be the child, but too blurred to identify. It hadn't been there before. He rewound, paused, stared, and that's when it hit him. This wasn't just someone erasing evidence. It was someone editing reality. The footage was being rewritten. But who has the power to do that? A school district. No. This was bigger, so he reached out to the only other person who might know the truth. An old contact from a case years back. A woman who used to investigate missing children until she disappeared from public records. No online presence, no employment history. After 2017, he used a code phrase one only she would recognize. Buried in a forum thread for amateur sleuths, and she responded. A single sentence: "If you're seeing them, it's already too late." But then, she said something else. Something he hadn't prepared for. "Check your medical file." Not your employment one. Your medical file. He didn't understand until he remembered a clinic visit months ago. A routine checkup after a fall. They'd asked strange questions back then. About memory, about dream patterns, about sensitivity to sound. He thought it was just overcautious. But now, he wasn't so sure. He requested the records. They denied the request, said no file existed. But he'd been there. He had the receipt. And there it was, again, that same rhythm. That pattern of erasing just enough to make you question your own sanity. The same technique used on the missing children. Make the truth seem like a glitch, a misremembered event, a dream you can't quite place. And that's when he found the photograph. Not the one of the boy. From his past, a new one. printed in black and white, slipped under his trailer door with no note. It showed him, standing in a hallway, mop in hand, but the timestamp was dated 5 years ago. Different state. Same hallway. Same door. Same school name. Only now, the child in the background wasn't the same boy. He wasn't even sure the child was real, because the face was blurred out, but not by accident, by design, and in the corner of the image, in smudged marker, were 5 chilling words. You were never just janitor. To be continued. Would you like the next part to escalate the psychological breakdown or begin unraveling the network behind these disappearances? He stared at the photograph for a long time, longer than he realized, until the edges began to curl from the heat of his fingers. That hallway, that door, it wasn't just a trick of memory. It was real, and it had happened before. In another state, under a different name. But why send this now? Why show him a version of himself caught in an event he couldn't recall, an event he should have remembered? And what did it mean that the child's face was intentionally blurred, as if someone had erased the identity not just from the file, but from his memory itself? The message at the bottom, "You were never just janitor," had a weight to it that pulled everything inside him into a slow, spiraling panic. It wasn't meant as a threat. It was a reveal, a shift in the ground. He'd been walking on, carefully, for years. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized something deeply unsettling. There were entire chunks of his life he couldn't fully account for. Not blackouts, exactly, just holes. Places where the memories felt, smoothed over. Rounded, edges sanitized. The next day, before dawn, he left his trailer and walked straight to the storage annex behind the school. He didn't bother with the main entrance this time. He picked the lock, slid the door open, and let the stale paper dry air hit him in the face. The smell of old chemicals and rotting cardboard, but he wasn't alone. Sitting cross-legged in the middle of the darkened room, as still as a statue, was a girl, not a student, older, late teens, maybe, hoodie pulled low, arms wrapped around her knees, just watching him. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She looked him dead in the eye and asked, without blinking, "Did you see your photo yet?" It was the way she said it, like she already knew the answer, like this was just the next stop in a train she'd been riding far longer than him. He crouched down, not moving too quickly. She looked familiar, but not in a way he could place. There was something behind her eyes, that same dull clarity he'd seen in the boy when they pulled him out of the vent. Not fear. She reached into her coat and slid something toward him across the floor. A laminated student ID badge, cracked across the middle. The name had been scratched off, but the face was his. Younger, maybe 15 years ago, but it was him. And the school name printed at the top wasn't Riverside. It was a different elementary school in another district. A school that had burned down in 2009. Official cause, faulty wiring. 0 fatalities. Case closed. Except he was starting to remember differently. The girl finally spoke again, more quiet this time, like her voice was coming from far away. They test us in the small schools first, easier to cover up. Less press, less parents that ask questions. When he asked her who they were, she just smiled, as if that was the only part he should have figured out already. Then she stood, brushed herself off, and walked straight past him. No hesitation, no questions. She was gone before he could follow, like she'd never been there at all. But she left the ID behind, and scrawled on the back, written in shaky blue ink, were the words, "Check the yearbooks. Compare the photos." One face appears in all of them. Back in his trailer, he sat with the yearbooks he'd quietly taken from the teacher's lounge over the past week, just a couple volumes at a time so no one would notice. First, he flipped through the class lists for the past 10 years. The same teacher names appeared again and again. But then, buried in the background of one of the class field trip photos, there it was, a man, standing behind the group, always slightly out of focus, not listed in the credits, not identified by name. He checked the next yearbook. There again, same face, same placement. Different school shirt. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but it wasn't the presence that chilled him, it was the expression. The man never smiled. Not once. He was watching, recording, like his purpose. There wasn't education, but observation. Then came the part that broke something open. In one of the yearbooks, the man wasn't just in the background. He was listed once as a school psychologist, but there was no record of his employment. No degrees. Just a name. Dr. Lenford Greaves. A name that, when searched online, returned nothing but dead links and page not found errors. He tried image search, nothing. But when he used the facial recognition tool on the old staff photo against his own database ones he'd quietly built while bouncing from job, 2 jobs a match came back at 84% certainty. A former federal psychological contractor who vanished from the public sector after a classified operation in 2012. And right then, something shifted again. The boy from the vent. He had said he recognized the man with the key. Not as a janitor. Not as a substitute, as someone he'd seen in dreams. The whispering wasn't just fear, it was conditioning. Patterns embedded in the subconscious, and now the same face was appearing across multiple schools, multiple years, quietly slipping into staff photos, then vanishing just before records were scrubbed. He needed answers, but he wouldn't get them alone, so he made a call. The woman who warned him before, the one who said, "If you're seeing them, it's already too late," finally agreed to meet. They arranged a public location, a rest stop off I-40, open 24 hours, quiet but not isolated. She arrived first. He recognized her instantly despite the years. She had the same eyes, sharp and tired. She wore a ball cap low, hoodie zipped to the chin. No names, no greetings, just questions. She slid a file folder across the table. Inside were copies of reports, disciplinary incidents that never made it into the school's public record. Every one of them tied to the same time frame, same areas. Children reporting strange dreams, fear of hallways, sudden nosebleeds, short-term memory loss. All dismissed by administrators as anxiety or sensitivity to light. But one report stood out because it wasn't filed by staff. It was filed by a bus driver. The driver claimed a child disappeared from the seat behind him during a routine drop-off. One moment there, next moment gone. And the onboard camera blacked out for 37 seconds. Just long enough, the bus company dismissed the driver. Mental health concerns. Case closed, but the woman leaned in, voice low, and asked something he hadn't expected. "Do you remember where you were that day?" He froze, because the date on the bus incident was one of the holes in his timeline. A week he couldn't place, a job he didn't finish, a memory he couldn't get to load, no matter how hard he tried. And then she said something else. "They don't erase you all at once. They fracture you, piece by piece, until you forget what you were really there for." That was when the lights flickered, just a tiny drop in voltage, barely noticeable. But they both saw it, the same flicker he'd seen in the school hallway, in the footage before it was altered, and she looked up, suddenly pale. "They know you're awake now." He turned, looked to the parking lot, and there, across the lane, was a man leaning against a dark van, tall, still watching. Same face, same unreadable stare, only this time, he smiled. Then he stepped back into the van and the license plate wasn't a plate at all, just a blank metal surface, and the van disappeared into the dark. No TAILLIGHTS, no sound, gone like it had never been there, but the file folder, gone to as if it had never existed, and the woman, her chair was still warm, but she was no longer beside him. To be continued. Would you like the next part to delve deeper into the secret experiments, or have the janitor attempt to confront the man in the photos directly? It started with the phone ringing at a time it never should have. The line he kept buried in the glove compartment of his old sedan, the one tied to no carrier plan. No contacts, no official existence, buzzed to life at exactly 3:12 a.m. there. Shouldn't have been service in that canyon, much less a signal strong enough to ring. He hadn't used that phone since Ohio, and even then, only to call in a favor nobody wanted to owe. His heart hitched in his chest as he stared at the screen. No number, just the word unknown, glowing against the darkness like a warning sign. He didn't answer. He couldn't. But when the voicemail icon blinked, something inside him twisted. He sat there in the driver's seat, frozen. The keys still in the ignition, but the engine long dead. When he finally listened, there were no words, just the sound of breathing. Slow, measured, and right before it cut off, a whisper, low, ragged, barely audible, spoke his name. Not his current name. Not the one on his school badge, the one from before, from a life buried under 7 different identities and 10 years of silence. He didn't go back to the trailer. He knew better. If they had the number, they had the location. Burned the phone in a coffee can behind the rest stop. Watched a plastic melt and curl in silence, breathing in the bitter stench of scorched circuitry. That night, he slept in the back seat, a crowbar under his coat, one eye half open, heart pounding to the rhythm of a clock that felt like it was counting down to something he didn't understand. By morning, something inside him had shifted. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It wasn't a puzzle. It was a trap, and he was already inside it. He drove back toward town with a gnawing dread, pulling at the back of his neck. Every car in the rearview mirror looked suspicious. Every jogger on the side of the road felt too perfectly timed. At a gas station on the edge of town, he saw a woman at the pump across from him holding a disposable Camar, the kind no one used anymore. She never pointed it at anything, just clicked, again and again. Her eyes never met his, but her body tensed like she knew exactly who was next to her. He left before filling the tank, drove 30 miles in the opposite direction, changed his hat, switched jackets. He could feel it now, that hum under the skin, that tightness in the chest. It wasn't just paranoia, it was experience. He was being followed. But it wasn't just him. That afternoon, he returned to Riverside. Told himself it was just to pick up his last paycheck to see if the science teacher who warned him had come back. But when he got there, the parking lot was half empty. A handwritten sign was taped to the front doors, closed for maintenance. He knew that lie. He'd written that kind of lie for other places before. It wasn't maintenance, it was containment. he slipped around the back, through the kitchen entrance. The air inside was too still, the halls too quiet. And when he got to the janitor's closet, he found the lock had been changed but not properly. It wasn't secured with a district padlock. It was a contractor-grade digital keypad. No markings, no ID, and the security camera above it. A newer model than the rest of the system, a different make. Someone had upgraded it overnight. He turned to leave and caught a flash of movement down the hall. Just a blur but enough to set every nerve in his body on edge. He followed, cautious, past the vending machines and the unused drama room, until he reached the exit by the gym. That's when he saw it. Something that shouldn't have been possible. The missing boy's mother. Standing at the door, motionless, her hands clutching a yellow manila folder to her chest. Her eyes glassy distant didn't register him at first. But when they did, she didn't blink. She stepped toward him slowly, like her body was moving separately from her mind. She pressed the folder into his chest, leaned in, and whispered, "They're taking the ones who remember." Then she turned and walked away, like she didn't know who she'd just spoken to. He tried to follow, but by the time he rounded the corner, she was gone, vanished into a building that was supposed to be locked down. The folder she left behind, empty, except for one thing. A photo dot of him, but not recent dot from his 20s, in a hospital room, hooked up to machines, eyes closed, labeled, patient number 76. Failed extraction, memory reconstruction, incomplete. He dropped to a crouch in the hallway, chest heaving. The photo trembled in his hand. This wasn't surveillance. It wasn't observation. It was something far worse. His memories, his identity might not even belong to him. Had he been a patient? Had he been part of something, and then released into the world with only fragments? Was that why he'd been drawn to each of these schools without knowing why? Were they monitoring him? Were activating him? The lines between hunter and prey were collapsing. And then it happened. His old friend, the analyst he'd trusted with the badge number, stopped returning messages. At first he thought it was caution. Then he checked the signal logs. The phone line had been disabled permanently. He drove 6 hours to the analyst's last known address. Apartment cleaned out. Landlord said he left without notice. Left everything behind: wallet, keys, even shoes. Just walked out, the man said, tapping his head. Didn't seem right in the head when he left. Kept saying he forgot. What did that mean? Gaps in memory, gaps in time. Were these people, these watchers, not people at all, but constructs built inside moments no one remembered? And then he remembered the science teacher's warning. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. What if this wasn't about rescuing a child? What if it was about pulling back a veil not meant to be lifted? And now, he couldn't unsee it. Every hallway flicker, every file corrupted, every piece of his own past that had been surgically erased. He stared at the photo again, the one with his younger self in that hospital bed, and noticed just in the corner window, a blurry reflection, and in that reflection, a face watching him. Same face, same expression, the man from the yearbooks, from the parking lot, from the van. But this time, he hadn't planned to go back to the school again, not after the photo. Not after the woman with the folder, not after feeling like his mind was slowly being peeled apart. But something had shifted. Something subtle, almost subconscious. There was a detail in the background of that hospital picture just past the face in the reflection. A poster on the wall, not a generic one about hand washing or hospital procedures. It was a school fundraiser flyer, specific, recent, and the name of the school, Riverside Elementary. The same one where the child disappeared. The same one he had just been working in, except the photo had been taken over a decade ago. He stared at it for hours, enlarged it, adjusted the filters, checked the photo's metadata, but the date never changed. The photo wasn't new. It was old. The same school, the same corridors, but in a time when he shouldn't have been anywhere near it. That meant the building had been used for something before. Something that had nothing to do with education. He went back under the cover of night, heart pounding as he bypassed the locks the same way he used to in other lives, with a bypass card and a magnet rig. Slipping past the camera line, he made it into the old maintenance tunnels, places no one mapped publicly. That's when he found the elevator, not a staff elevator, not one that students or teachers ever used. This one didn't go up, it only went down. And the panel didn't have floors, just a keycard slot. He stared at it, stunned. Something deep underground. Something hidden beneath a public school. He didn't have the clearance, but someone did. Someone he thought he could trust. He drove straight to the only person who'd ever hinted at the truth, the school's guidance counselor. A quiet woman in her 50s who always seemed to be in the background. Who never missed a day. Who knew every child's name before they even enrolled. She'd always been kind to him. Never asked questions about his past. Never raised a brow at the long hours he kept. But that night, when he showed up at her home, she didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she was already packing. She let him in without a word. No questions, no greetings. Just a resigned kind of silence that felt too practiced, too prepared. He asked her what was underground. Why the school appeared in a photo taken a decade ago. Why his face had been scrubbed from every federal system but appeared in a medical archive tied to military memory testing. She didn't lie. She didn't even flinch. She just pointed to a small metal case sitting open on her kitchen table. Inside was a series of photos, files, newspaper clippings that never made it to press, government memos redacted to near blankness, and one document at the very bottom labeled, Janus Project, Echo Class Trials with his name printed next. To it, she looked at him, her voice low, barely above a whisper. You were never a janitor, not really. You were sent here to forget something no one else was allowed to remember. It felt like a punch to the chest. He backed away, brain spinning, reality bending. But she wasn't done. She pulled out a school yearbook, the one he'd kept seeing altered, the one with the man's face that never aged. Except in this version, there were two names under that man's photo. One was the alias he'd come to recognize. The other was his own. Not a student, not staff, not a visitor, co-director. He'd been one of the creators. He sank into the chair across from her, hand shaking, stomach hollow. Everything he thought he was the wandering drifter with a conscience. The silent custodian, uncovering a mystery, was a role, a construct, a fake. If he ever got too close, the memories would reboot, divert him back to maintenance tasks and invisible corridors, lost in routines designed to keep him harmless. But something had failed. Something in the programming had cracked. And now he was remembering not just who he was, but what he helped build. She warned him. They'd know now that the memory breach was no longer just partial, that the fallback identity wasn't holding. He asked her what Echo Class meant. She hesitated, then told him the truth. Echoes are people like you, people we erased, then reinserted, but you were the first to come back on your own. He demanded to know why the child was taken, why the school was being used. But before she could answer, her eyes locked on the front door. A shadow passed across the frosted glass. Then another. She didn't panic, just handed him a key from her necklace and whispered, Basement, East Wing, File Room 7. It's the only way to prove what we did. And just like that, she shoved him toward the back exit and closed the door behind him. He ran. As he reached the alley, headlights swept across his body. A black sedan. No plates. Then another behind it. He ducked behind a dumpster, heart slamming, the counselor's voice echoing in his ears. You were never a janitor. As the cars idled in front of the house, two men in gray stepped out. Not police, not government. Something else. Their movements too smooth, their expressions too empty. Like actors reading a script for the thousandth time. Then came the blast. The windows of the counselor's home blew outward in a rush of flame and glass. The shockwave knocked him back, ears ringing. He watched in horror as the roof collapsed inward, fire licking up into the sky. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. This wasn't about one child. This was a program that never ended, a cover-up still in motion. And he was the loose thread they were willing to burn the whole town to erase. He gripped the keycard in his hand like it was the last truth left in the world. And behind him, from the shadows near the dumpster, a voice whispered his real name, a name he hadn't heard in over 12 years, a name not even he remembered giving. To be continued. Would you like the next part to follow him into the basement to uncover the secret files? Or switch focus to someone else watching all of this unfold from the outside? The smoke still clung to his jacket hours after the fire had swallowed the house whole. He drove for miles in silence, window halfway down, engine humming like a sedative. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to stay moving. Every stop felt like a target. Every shadow looked like someone he used to know. When the GPS glitched and redirected him twice to the same gas station, he threw the phone out the window. He couldn't trust anything digital anymore. Whatever they'd done to him before, however deep they'd gone to rewrite his memories, they hadn't expected him to fight the algorithm. But now that he had, they were watching. Not like before. Not like with cameras or tags or trackers. This felt different and intimate, as if the more he remembered, the closer they got. He finally pulled into an old trailer lot on the edge of town, the kind of place where names didn't matter and no one asked questions after dark. Inside, the keycard the counselor gave him pulsed slightly under blacklight. It wasn't just access, it was tagged with hidden data, embedded with coordinates and codes, none of which made sense until he remembered a phrase scribbled in one of the janitor's closets from months ago. East Wing doesn't go east. That was the trick. The school had been redesigned to mislead. What was labeled as the east side of the building was actually a mirrored false wing. To access the real records room, you had to go down through a boiler shaft that hadn't functioned. In 15 years, the keycard wasn't for a door. It was for a biometric vault hidden beneath a staircase most people never even noticed. But before he could plan the return, a familiar face appeared on his trailer doorstep, bruised, frantic, whispering his name like a warning. It was her, the only person who ever saw through his quiet, unnoticed existence, the front office secretary. She'd always greeted him like he mattered, always offered him coffee like she knew he was struggling. Now she was in tears, holding a burner phone, and shaking so hard she couldn't speak. He brought her inside, and when she finally calmed enough to explain, everything twisted. She had received a photo and image of herself, unconscious, in the trunk of a car, the timestamp. 3 hours in the future. He was smiling. To be continued. Would you like the next part to explore the janitor's fractured memories or shift to someone else being drawn into the conspiracy from another angle? Someone was watching her too, playing with her like they played with him. And worse, the message attached simply read, "Tell him to stop, or it becomes reality." He felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. They weren't just trying to bury the past, they were using it like a weapon, a threat, and she wasn't the only one they'd warned. His brother, estranged for years, living off the grid, called him from a private line. Voice low, scared, said men had come to his cabin, pretending to be census workers. One left a thumb drive on the counter before disappearing. On it was a video footage of him, our main character, testing the prototype memory reprogramming on a child who looked eerily like the one currently missing. He didn't remember doing it, but the angle, the mannerisms, the voice, it was him. Or at least, the version of him that had been buried under layers of lies. His brother didn't accuse him, didn't scream, just asked a question that nearly stopped his heart. How many more are there? Now he was faced with an impossible choice. If he continued, more people could die. People he once loved. People whose only crime was knowing him. But if he stopped, if he ran, if he disappeared, then the project would continue unchallenged. More children would vanish. More identities would be erased. More memories would be rewritten until no one remembered the truth, not even the people who built it. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the keycard on the table. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. The kind of rage that only comes when you realize your own life has been hijacked by something that called itself protection. He thought of the woman at the school, the counselor who died trying to help him, of the secretary now curled up on his couch, whispering prayers to gods she didn't believe in, of the child's voice that still echoed through his dreams, calling out for help in a place no one else could hear. And then came the final blow. The secretary's phone lit up again. A live video feed, grainy, shaky. It showed the missing child, chained to a gurney in a room lined with monitors. And standing behind the camera was the principal, the man he'd worked under for months. The man who'd shaken his hand and said, "We all play our part." He smashed the phone against the wall. But it didn't stop the feed. It continued, right there on the TV screen, hijacking the signal, flashing one final message that made his blood run cold. You have 12 hours. Choose the child, or choose the truth. He stared at the screen, jaw clenched, breath shallow, because the truth wasn't just something he wanted anymore. It was something he might have helped create. And now, the only way to stop it was to destroy everything he ever built. To be continued. Would you like the next part to follow his infiltration of the East Wing? Or reveal the secret past of the principal and how he got involved in the Janus project? The storm hit just as he reached the edge of the campus, the real one, not the one shown on the public records or the district's glossy website. Rain slammed the windshield like it was trying to keep him out, and the wind clawed at the frame of his stolen maintenance van, screaming through cracks in the window seals. But even that chaos couldn't drown out the sound of his heart pounding. He had 12 hours, maybe less. The video feed was real. The gurney, the child, the Striel. And now, the game had shifted. This wasn't about proving the janitor mattered anymore. It was about how many lives he could save before the truth swallowed them all whole. He passed through the final security gate with the fake badge he lifted from the assistant superintendent's car last night. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, which meant someone on the inside wanted him to get in. Or worse, they expected him. He parked in a blind spot between two trash units and grabbed the duffel from the back seat. Not weapons, not armor, just paper. Pages of evidence he'd compiled over the last 5 weeks, file names, timestamps, audio clips, buried in corrupted archives. One page in particular kept catching his eye. The payroll records. The janitorial staff had changed 12 times over the last 3 years, but every one of their background checks traced back to the same third-party firm, and that firm, registered to a holding company owned by the school board's transportation director, a man who'd never stepped foot on school grounds in a decade, a man who also happened to be the missing child's godfather. He slipped through the maintenance tunnel behind the athletics building, crawling past rusted pipes and forgotten blueprints until he reached a locked hatch marked Electro Archive 9. The latch was old, but the fingerprint scanner was Newsleak, touch-sensitive, blinking with power. He hovered his thumb over it and hesitated. How did they expect him to open it? Then he remembered the cut on his hand from 2 days ago. That wasn't an accident. At the time, he thought he'd just scraped himself on a vent. But now, he realized it was harvested. Someone had taken his print without him knowing. And if that was true, the whole system was rigged to recognize him as authorized personnel. The door hissed open. Inside, rows of computers, humming softly, screens flashing data streams and looping patterns. He didn't understand most of it, but one screen showed a name he recognized. His mat, not just his file, surveillance of him from years ago. Conversations with people he didn't remember, having emails he never sent, memories he couldn't recall. They'd been watching him long before the janitor job, long before the missing child. He wasn't just part of the cleanup crew, he was part of the experiment. Before he could process that, he heard it, footsteps, heavy, deliberate. He ducked behind a server rack just as two men in security uniforms entered the room. One had a gun, the other had a clipboard. They weren't looking for him, they were checking systems, reading updates. One of them spoke into a radio and said something that made his blood run cold. Phase 3 begins in 40 minutes. Tell the board the janitor's status is still classified. Still classified. He had broken into a classified site using credentials he didn't even know he had, which meant someone had built this entire path for him, layered it with obstacles, misdirection, clues that felt like victories but were actually checkpoints. He hadn't been escaping anything. He'd been led. He waited until they left, then accessed a server console and searched one phrase, Janus procedure. The screen filled with entries, case studies, trial logs, names, so many names, children, staff, faculty, all listed under observational integrity and memory fracture thresholds, and buried among them his own case ID. There it was. The beginning. He had once been a substitute teacher, 5 years ago, applied for a short-term job during summer school. It was there they'd selected him, quiet, dependable, forgotten, the perfect template. They stripped him of his past, buried his records, and reintroduced him as a custodian, and nobody noticed. Nobody asked questions. That was the whole point of the Janus procedure. Destroy the self, reassign the body, observe behavior, all under the guise of normalcy. A school janitor was never supposed to matter, so he could be erased without resistance. Then a screen flashed red. Breached. Secondary host identified. A photo appeared. It was her, the secretary, her image displayed. Alongside a medical tag, Control Group 8 discontinued. She hadn't been helping him by accident. She had been implanted, monitored, used to steer him. But something had gone wrong. She'd broken protocol, chosen to care. And now she was marked for termination. He staggered back, heart racing, stomach twisting. The betrayal wasn't just the school. It wasn't just the board. It was everyone. The janitorial supervisor who always disappeared during lockdown drills. The guidance counselor who conveniently left behind half-reassed folders. The front office staff who double-checked visitor logs even when no one signed in. They were all in on it, or being used, or both. The conspiracy wasn't a crack in the system. It was the system. And just when he thought he'd reached the bottom, another video feed lit up the screen. Real-time footage, inside a boardroom. 7 people. 2 of them were school officials he recognized. One was his old therapist. The others were strangers, but they wore government tags on their collars. In the center of the table, projected in holographic display, was him. They were discussing his deactivation. One of them said calmly, "We'll let him think he's getting close. Let him find the child. It'll make the test cleaner, more organic. But if he deviates from the script, terminate with extreme prejudice." And then the screen went black. He wasn't uncovering the truth. He was walking straight into the final phase of an experiment he never agreed to join. And worse, he was starting to remember why he was chosen. Ask ChatGPT. The elevator groaned as it descended into the lowest sublevel, deeper than anything he knew existed beneath the school. Every flicker of fluorescent light overhead buzzed like a countdown, and the walls lined with steel and biometric scanners reflected back a version of himself he no longer recognized. He wasn't the janitor anymore. Not even the man they tried to erase. He was something else now, something that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt through layers of deception, grief, and betrayal. And with every passing second, the tension built not just in the air around him, but in his very blood. At the bottom, the doors opened with a heavy, final clang, like the closing of a vault. This was it. No more games, no more hints, no more memory gaps. Just the truth waiting. He stepped into what looked like a medical observation theater, only colder. In the center of the room stood a child, barely breathing, strapped upright to a vertical gurney, eyes fluttering as if trapped in REM sleep. Monitors traced patterns on surrounding walls, memories, dreams, or something far worse. And across the room, standing still, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years, was the superintendent, not hunched, not weary like he appeared in public, but straight-backed, precise, dressed in a black lab coat over a military-grade exosuit. The transformation was so complete it felt like hallucination, but it wasn't. The old man nodded once, and said, calmly, "You were never meant to wake up this far." In that instant, it all clicked. The therapy sessions, the endless noise in the background of his memory. The child wasn't a random victim, it was his daughter, or more accurately what was left of her. The test wasn't to erase his mind, it was to measure the threshold of paternal instinct against psychological erosion. They wanted to know how far a parent could be pushed before identity, loyalty, and reason collapsed. Every face he trusted, every detour he took it was all to see if love could survive memory death, but they made one mistake. They let him remember just enough to care. The superintendent circled the gurney like a scientist admiring a specimen. He explained it without shame. The school was a front. The children split into test groups based on trauma thresholds. The staff either synthetic constructs or real people paid into silence. The Janitor program, his program, was phase 4 of a classified behavioral conditioning initiative once greenlit by a defunct agency no longer recognized by any known branch of government. But instead of breaking him, it reactivated him. You were the control variable, the only one with real stakes, the superintendent said, almost with pride. She responded to your presence. That ruined everything. Rage boiled up so fast it made him dizzy. He lunged, but the old man was faster. A jolt of electricity surged through the floor and slammed him to the ground. Paralyzed, helpless, the gurney began to lower into a chamber below the floor. Robotic arms surrounding it like insects, hungry for data. We've already mapped her consciousness, the superintendent said. Your pain was just a side effect. But you're here now, so let's finish it properly. And then the lights went out. A scream erupted from the control booth. Sparks flew. A figure leaped down from the ceiling, ducked a blur, fast and precise, taking out the armed guards with surgical strikes. It was the secretary, bloodied, breathing hard, eyes wild. She wasn't just another implanted observer. She was the first failure of the program subject, 0, and she'd hacked the system from the inside to protect him. She threw him a small injector antidote to the paralysis. The moment it hit his neck, his muscles returned like a flood. Together, they stormed the command console, but the superintendent had already vanished, gone through a back corridor only he had access to. The final chamber began collapsing in on itself, walls retracting, data melting in real time. We have one shot, she shouted. If we extract her now, she lives, but your memory of her dies. If we don't, she stays intact, but so do you. You choose. There's no both. It shattered him, the choice. Save her, and forget she was ever his daughter, or remember everything, and let her fade as a casualty of his clarity. The clock ticked down. Gas hissed from the walls. She grabbed his hand. Pick now. Before they reset the room, tears streaming, he made the call. The chamber shut. And everything went white. He woke up 2 weeks later in a quiet rehab center. Upstate, clean sheets, generic art on the walls. A name tag on his wrist that read Daniel Porter. Not his name, not anymore. A doctor told him he'd suffered a psychological episode while working at a school. Trauma-induced identity dissociation. Common in veterans, she said, but out in the hallway, a girl with bright eyes and a bandage around her wrist sat drawing in a sketchbook. When he passed her, she looked up and whispered, "I remember you. But we're not supposed to talk yet." And, just like that, the whole nightmare rippled back beneath the surface. Not gone, just buried, waiting. The first snowfall came early, that year blanketing the school grounds in a quiet that felt more sacred than seasonal. The town had already started to forget what happened. Most never even knew. That's how these things are built. Layers of false memories, rerouted narratives, and paperwork that makes it all look like a mental health leave or a workplace incident. The school board replaced the superintendent with a bland interim director whose only concern was test scores. The cameras were quietly removed. The underground sublevel, once humming with secrets, was sealed off and officially condemned. 2. Structural decay. No one questioned it, because no one wanted to. The deeper you dig, the more you risk waking up something you can't put back to sleep. That's what they count on. But he remembered. Not in the details those were, still, fractured, tucked behind locked doors in his mind, but in the way his hands sometimes shook when he passed the janitor's closet, or how certain smells brought back flickers of that cold metal floor. And of course, in the way the little girl sometimes looked at him across the cafeteria during parent visits, sketchbook in hand, drawing landscapes of places no one had taught her to remember. He'd been reassigned as a groundskeeper, not technically a promotion, not even a recognition, just a quiet reintegration. But this time, he chose it. He chose the silence, the simplicity, the solitude. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he understood now that the truth wasn't always something to scream from rooftops. Sometimes it was something to carry, alone, carefully, like a flame in the dark. The woman who helped him, the secretary. Subject 0, was never seen again, at least not in public. Some whispered she was taken back into the program. Others said she vanished off-grid with a new identity. But one night, months later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a sketchbook, page after page of surveillance diagrams, clues, names of people in power who were involved, not just in that school, but across a chain of institutions, and on the very last page, a hand-drawn map of a place in Nevada marked only with one word, Phase 5. He burned the contents by morning, not out of fear but resolve. He understood now that this wasn't about vengeance, it was about protection. He'd done what he could. For now, but if they ever came for her again he'd be ready. There were still nights when sleep didn't come easy, when shadows stretched too long and the hum of the janitor's closet returned like a distant heartbeat. But there were also days of peace, of her laughter echoing down the hall, of moments where the world didn't feel like a lie stitched together by architects of control. He'd take the trade. Because peace wasn't about forgetting, it was about choosing to remember only what mattered most. One afternoon, as he swept the steps leading to the library, he paused, watching the girl in the courtyard. Her hair blew wildly in the wind as she chased a paper plane, and for a moment, he swore it wasn't a paper plane at all but something else. A memory folded into shape, a message carried through time. She turned and waved at him. He waved back, eyes full, heart full, the cold air biting but not breaking him, and he knew. Whatever came next, whatever shadows still lingered on the edge of this world, she was free. And that was enough. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of inner strength and resilience. Until next time, stay strong, stay brave, and never forget your worth.